They came for us in the night, as they always do. I was 23 years old, a dock worker in the lower transit levels of Hive Gloriana on the world of Scintilla, a man whose greatest ambition had been to earn enough credits to move my family 3 levels closer to the sun. I had a wife named Sarah and a daughter named Mira, who had just learned to speak my name. And I had spent the evening of my taking playing with that child, listening to her laughter echo off the metal walls of our hab unit, believing in my ignorance that tomorrow would be much like today, that my life would continue in the small patterns I had built for it. I did not know that across the Calixis sector, the Imperial Navy had suffered losses in a campaign against Orc raiders. I did not know that 14 vessels required crew replacements numbering in the hundreds of thousands. I did not know that the Administratum had authorized press gangs to sweep through the lower hive levels of a dozen worlds, harvesting bodies to fill the gaps that war had torn in the Emperor's fleets. I knew only that men in naval uniforms appeared in our corridor without warning, that they carried shock mauls and wore the expressions of those who have done terrible things so many times that the doing no longer registers as terrible. I knew only that they kicked indoors and dragged out everyone between the ages of 15 and 50, that they separated families with the casual efficiency of butchers separating meat from bone, that they beat those who resisted and shot those who ran, and processed those who submitted with the bored indifference of functionaries completing routine paperwork. I fought. Emperor, forgive me, I fought. Because Sarah was screaming and Mira was crying, and every instinct I possessed demanded that I protect them from the men who had come to take me away. I broke one man's nose before they brought me down, drove my fist into his face with all the desperate strength of a father defending his home. It accomplished nothing. They beat me until I could no longer stand, until blood filled my mouth and my vision swam with darkness, until fighting became impossible and submission became the only path that did not lead to immediate death. The last thing I saw before they dragged me from my hab unit was Sarah's face, frozen in an expression of terror and grief that I have carried with me across 37 years of service. The last thing I heard was Mira calling my name, the word she had just learned to speak, repeated over and over, as her father was torn from her life forever. I never saw them again. I do not know if they survived. The lower hive levels of Gloriana were swept clean that night, tens of thousands taken for the Emperor's ships, and in the chaos of such harvests, records are not kept, families are not tracked. The human cost is not calculated beyond the simple mathematics of bodies acquired versus bodies required. My name is Brennan Cole. I was pressed into service aboard the Imperial Navy battleship, Righteous Fury, on the night of my taking, and I have served in the void ever since. I have risen from the lowest ranks of the ship's hierarchy to a position of modest authority, have survived wars and plagues and the screaming passage through the warp that claims so many who travel between the stars. I have watched generations be born and die within the Righteous Fury's hull, have seen children grow to adulthood, knowing nothing but the rumble of engines and the distant thunder of weapons, have become an old man in a world of metal and recycled air, where the sun is a memory and the sky is a concept explained in children's stories. This is my testimony. This is what it means to be taken, to be pressed, to be made property of an institution that sees human beings not as souls with names and families and dreams, but as resources to be harvested, processed, and consumed in the eternal war that defines the imperium of man. I do not tell this story to complain. Complaint is a luxury that pressed men cannot afford, a weakness that earns only punishment in the rigid hierarchy of naval service. I tell it to bear witness to ensure that someone knows what happens in the lower decks of the Emperor's warships, to give voice to the millions upon millions of souls who serve and suffer and die without ever being recognized as anything more than numbers in a ledger that tracks the Navy's endless appetite for human fuel. The processing facility they brought us to was a converted cargo bay in the orbital station above Scintilla. I remember little of the journey there. Shock and blood loss had reduced my awareness to fragments, flashes of sensation that my mind could not assemble into coherent narrative. I remember the press of bodies around me. Hundreds of us packed into transport shuttles designed for cargo rather than passengers. I remember the smell of fear, sweat, and blood, and the particular chemical odor of shock mall discharge. I remember prayers being whispered by those who still believed prayer might accomplish something, and I remember the silence of those who had already understood that the God Emperor, whatever his power might be, did not intervene in the fates of individual souls. They processed us like livestock. Medical servitors scanned our bodies for diseases or defects that might make us unsuitable for service. Administratum clerks recorded our names and origins in data slates that would follow us for the rest of our lives. Priests of the ecclesiarchy spoke benedictions over us in groups of 100, blessing our service to the emperor in words that felt like mockery given the circumstances of our conscription. And through it all, naval ratings with shock malls walked the lines, ready to discipline any who showed signs of resistance or despair. I watched a man die in that processing facility. He had been taken from the same corridor as me, a worker from the manufactorum 3 levels below my own, a father like myself, whose children's cries still echoed in his ears. He could not accept what was happening. He could not make his mind bend around the reality that his life as he had known it was over, that he would never return to the family he had been building, that everything he had worked for had been erased in a single night by forces he could not comprehend or resist. He tried to run. There was nowhere to run to. We were in an orbital station surrounded by the void, but his mind had broken past the point where logic held sway, and he simply ran, sprinting toward a door that led nowhere, screaming words that might have been prayers or curses, or simply the incoherent sounds of a soul that could not contain its grief. They shot him. One bolt round, center mass. A casual execution that took less than a second and drew barely a glance from the officers overseeing the processing. His body was dragged away by servitors. His blood was mopped from the deck by other servitors, and the processing continued as though nothing had happened, as though a man's life had not just been ended for the crime of being unable to accept his enslavement. I learned in that moment the first lesson of pressed service. You are nothing. Your life has no value. Your death has no meaning. You exist to serve, and if you cannot serve, you will be disposed of and replaced by the next body in the endless line of bodies that the Imperium harvests from its billion worlds. It is a hard lesson. It breaks some who learn it, as it broke the man who tried to run. But those who survive that breaking, those who absorb the truth and adapt to it, and find within themselves some core of will that persists despite the stripping away of everything they once believed about their own worth. We become something else, something harder, something that can endure what comes next. They assigned me to the Righteous Fury 3 days after my taking, a battleship of the Gothic class, one of the great vessels of the battle fleet Calixis, home to 40,000 souls who lived and worked and died within a hull that stretched 5 kilometers from prow to stern. I remember seeing it through the viewport of the shuttle that carried us from the processing station, a mountain of metal hanging against the stars, its surface bristling with weapons that could crack continents. its engines burning with light that rivaled the sun it orbited. I had never seen anything so vast. I had never imagined that human hands could build something so immense, so terrible, so beautiful in its brutal functionality. And I understood, looking upon that ship, that I was about to become part of something that dwarfed everything I had ever known, that my individual existence was about to be subsumed into a machine that would not notice if I lived or died, that would continue to function regardless of what happened to the tiny, insignificant speck of flesh that had once been Brennan Cole. The shuttle docked, the hatches opened, and I stepped into the belly of the beast that would be my home for the next 37 years. I have not set foot on solid ground since that day. I have not breathed unrecycled air. I have not seen a horizon or felt wind on my face, or experienced any of the simple sensations that I once took for granted as part of what it meant to be alive. I have known only the ship, the rumble of its engines, the hum of its systems, the thunder of its guns, the screaming of its passage through the warp. I have known only service, only duty, only the endless labor that keeps a vessel of this size functioning, that keeps 40,000 souls alive in the hostile void between stars. This is my life now. This is what I was made into on the night they took me from my family. Let me tell you what it is like. The lower decks of an Imperial battleship are not designed for human habitation. They are designed for function, for efficiency, for the housing of the countless systems that keep a vessel of war operational. That human beings must live within them is an afterthought, a concession to the unfortunate biological requirements of the crew that tends the machines. I was assigned to the bilge crews on my first day aboard the Righteous Fury. The bilges are the lowest inhabited spaces of the ship, a labyrinth of crawlways and access tunnels that run beneath the main decks, where the waste products of 40,000 lives accumulate and must be processed, where leaks from 1,000 different systems pool and stagnate, where the air is thick with fumes that burn the lungs, and the darkness is broken only by the flickering of ancient lumen strips that no one has maintained in centuries. We worked in teams of 12, crawling through spaces too narrow to stand, breathing through filters that clogged with filth within hours and had to be cleaned and reused because replacements were rationed. We cleared blockages with our hands when the tools broke, waded through fluids that I learned not to examine too closely, sealed leaks with patches that would hold for days or weeks before failing and requiring the same work to be done again. The bilge never stayed clean. It could not stay clean. It was a living system, constantly generating new problems, constantly demanding attention, constantly threatening to overwhelm the crews who labored within it. The smell never leaves you. This is something no one tells you before you enter the bilge cruise, something you cannot understand until you have experienced it yourself. It permeates your skin, your hair, your clothing, seeps into your pores until it becomes part of you, until other crew members can identify a bilge worker by scent alone. I scrubbed myself raw in the communal wash stations for months after my assignment, convinced that I could remove the taint if I just worked hard enough at it. I could not. The smell became my identity, the mark that told everyone who encountered me exactly where I stood in the ship's China hierarchy. We slept in barracks carved from spaces between machinery, 50 men to a room designed for 20, stacked in bunks 3 high, with barely enough space to turn over, breathing each other's exhalations, listening to each other's nightmares. There was no privacy. There was no silence. There was only the constant presence of other bodies, other sounds, other smells, the inescapable reality that you were never alone, could never be alone, would never again experience the simple luxury of solitude that I had once taken for granted. The food was nutrient-paced, dispensed from machines that had been manufacturing the same substance for centuries. A grey slurry that contained everything the human body required for survival, and nothing that the human soul craved for pleasure. It tasted of nothing. It smelled of nothing. It filled the stomach without satisfying the hunger, sustained the flesh while starving something deeper, something that I did not have words for until I had been eating it for years, and realized that what I missed was not flavor, but choice. The simple ability to decide what I would put into my own body. I learned the hierarchy quickly. In the Imperial Navy, your worth is measured by your deck. The higher you live, the closer to the bridge, the more valuable you are considered to be. The bilge crews are the lowest of the low, beneath even the gun crews and the engine ratings, valued only marginally more than the servitors who share our workspace. We were supervised by petty officers who had risen from the bilges themselves and who treated those beneath them with the casual cruelty of men who had suffered and saw no reason why others should suffer less. We were disciplined by the boatswains, massive men, armed with neural whips who patrolled the lower decks, enforcing order through pain. And above them all, distant and godlike, were the officers, men and women born to naval families, raised in the upper decks, who viewed the pressed crews as something between livestock and machinery, necessary for the ship's function, but not worthy of consideration as human beings. I saw my first flogging in my second week aboard. A man from my bilge crew had been caught stealing food. Not much, just a handful of protein supplement from a storage locker that he had passed during a work shift. He was hungry. We were all hungry. The rations allocated to bilge crews were calculated for survival, not satisfaction, and the constant physical labor of our work burned calories faster than the paste could replace them. He had stolen because his body demanded more than it was given, because the mathematics of intake versus expenditure did not balance, because hunger is a force that eventually overwhelms all other considerations. They flogged him in the central assembly space of our deck section, stripped to the waist and bound to a metal frame, while a bosun administered 50 lashes with a neural whip. I was required to watch, as all members of his crew were required to watch. This was the point, not merely to punish the offender, but to educate the witnesses, to burn into our minds the consequences of transgression, to ensure that we understood what awaited us if we stepped outside the boundaries that had been drawn around our lives. The neural whip does not merely cut flesh, it stimulates pain receptors directly, amplifies the agony of each stroke 100-fold, ensures that the punishment is felt not just in the body, but in every fiber of the nervous system. The man screamed until his voice broke, until no sound emerged from his throat but a rasping wheeze, until he hung limp in his bonds and the bosun had to check his pulse between strokes to ensure he remained alive. He died 3 days later. The wounds had become infected. Medical care for bilge crews was limited, and the antiseptics available were insufficient for wounds that had been inflicted in an environment saturated with biological contaminants. He died in his bunk, surrounded by men who had watched him suffer and could do nothing to help. His body carried away by servitors who processed it into the same organic recycling systems that processed all the ship's biological waste. I learned in that moment the second lesson of pressed service. The system is not designed for your survival. It is designed for the ship's function, and you are a replaceable component whose individual continuation matters only insofar as it serves the greater mechanism. If you break, you will be disposed of and replaced. If you die, your body will be recycled and your bunk will be filled by the next pressed man to come aboard. The ship does not mourn. The ship does not remember. The ship simply continues, eternal and indifferent, while the human fuel that powers it is consumed and replenished in an endless cycle. I adapted. What choice did I have? I learned the rhythms of the bilge, learned which tunnels were safe and which held dangers that could kill an unwary worker. I learned to read the moods of the petty officers, to know when to work hard and when to merely appear to work hard, to navigate the complex social dynamics of men pressed together in conditions designed to breed conflict. I learned to suppress the memories of my wife and daughter, to lock them in a chamber of my mind that I visited only in the darkest hours of the night cycle, to function as though my life before the taking had been a dream rather than a reality. And I learned to watch for opportunity, because opportunity was the only path upward, the only escape from the bilges that did not involve death or disgrace. The opportunity came in my third year, when a plasma conduit ruptured in the section adjacent to our work area. The explosion killed 6 men instantly, including the petty officer who supervised our crew. In the chaos that followed, with fires spreading and systems failing, and the ship's damage control teams struggling to contain the disaster, I organized the survivors. I directed them to seal bulkheads, to activate suppression systems, to perform the tasks that needed to be performed while our superiors were occupied with larger concerns. By the time order was restored, our section had been contained, our casualties minimized, and my name had come to the attention of officers who had never before known I existed. I was promoted, not to anything glorious, merely to the position of petty officer that the plasma rupture had vacated, the same position of minor authority that had been held by the man whose death created my opportunity. But it was advancement. It was movement. It was proof that the hierarchy, however brutal and arbitrary it might seem, could be climbed by those with the will and the fortune to climb it. That was 34 years ago. I have climbed further since then, risen through ranks that I once believed were forever beyond my reach, earned positions of authority that give me power over men who were once my equals. I am deck chief now, responsible for 300 souls who work the mid-bilge sections, who answer to me as I once answered to men like me, who look upon me with the same mixture of fear and resentment that I once felt toward those above me. I have become what I once hated. This is the truth that I have learned to accept, the price that advancement demands in the rigid hierarchy of naval service. To rise is to become the oppressor, to enforce the system that once oppressed you, to inflict upon others the same suffering that was inflicted upon you. There is no other path. There is no way to climb without stepping on those below. No way to gain authority without using that authority to maintain the order that makes authority possible. And across the Imperium, on 10,000 ships, millions of pressed men are learning the same lessons I learned, are making the same adaptations I made, are becoming the same things I became. We are the foundation upon which the Imperial Navy rests, the human fuel that powers its vessels, the expendable masses whose labor and suffering keep the Emperor's fleets sailing between the stars. No one speaks of us in the histories. No one records our names in the chronicles of great battles and glorious victories. We are invisible, anonymous, interchangeable, components of a machine that would not function without us, but that does not acknowledge our existence. This is the life of the pressed man. This is what we become. And I have not yet told you the worst of it. The worst of it is not the labor, though the labor is brutal beyond anything I could have imagined in my former life. It is not the hierarchy, though the hierarchy grinds souls to powder, with the casual indifference of millstones processing grain. It is not even the violence, though I have witnessed violence that would break the minds of those who have never served in the void, have seen men beaten and broken and killed for infractions so minor that they would not warrant comment in the world I once knew. The worst of it is the warp. I did not understand what warp travel meant until I experienced it for the first time, 3 months after my pressing. I had heard stories, of course. Everyone in the Imperium has heard stories of the dimension through which ships must pass to cross the impossible distances between stars. But stories cannot convey the reality. Words cannot capture what it feels like to have the barriers between your mind and that screaming hell thinned to gossamer, to feel things pressing against the Geller field that protects the ship, to know with absolute certainty that entities of impossible malevolence are aware of your existence and hungry for your soul. The lower decks suffer most during warp transit. This is something the officers do not speak of, something that is not recorded in official logs, something that every pressed man learns through experience rather than instruction. The Geller field is not uniform in its protection. It is stronger near the center of the ship, weaker at the extremities, and the bilges exist at the very edge of its embrace. We feel the warp more intensely than those who live above us. We hear whispers that the upper decks do not hear. We see shadows that move against the light, feel presences that press against our minds, experience dreams that are not dreams but intrusions, violations, the touch of things that should never be permitted to touch human consciousness. Men go mad during warp transit. This is accepted, expected, factored into the calculations that determine how many pressed men must be harvested to keep the ship functional. On every voyage through that screaming dimension, a percentage of the lower deck crew will break, will begin speaking in tongues, will claw at their own flesh, will attack their fellow workers with the sudden violence of the possessed, will have to be restrained or killed, or in the worst cases, fed into the plasma reactors, before whatever has taken root in their minds can spread to others. I have witnessed 17 transits in my years of service. I have survived them all, though survival is perhaps too strong a word for what I have experienced. I have emerged from each passage diminished in ways I cannot articulate, carrying memories of things I did not experience, knowing truths that no human mind should contain. The warp leaves marks on those who pass through it, and those marks accumulate, layer upon layer, until the man who emerges from the 17th transit bears little resemblance to the man who entered the first. I dream of things now that I did not dream before. I see patterns in the flickering of lumen strips that others do not see. I hear voices in the rumble of the engines, voices that speak my name, that whisper promises I have learned not to listen to, that remind me with every breath that the warp knows me, remembers me, waits for the moment when my resistance finally fails. I am not corrupted. The chaplains have examined me, have declared me free of taint, have blessed me with oils and prayers that they assure me provide protection, but I am not unchanged. No one who travels through the warp emerges unchanged, and this is the fate of every pressed man, every soul harvested from the hive worlds and agri-colonies and mining stations of the Imperium, every body fed into the machine that keeps the Navy sailing. They do not know what awaits them. They cannot know. And by the time they understand, it is far too late to escape. But the warp, terrible as it is, represents only sporadic horror. The trauma of transit, repeated at intervals that might be months or years depending on the ship's deployment. There is another horror that is constant, that permeates every moment of existence aboard a vessel like the Righteous Fury, that cannot be escaped or adapted to or made bearable through familiarity. The horror of void combat. I experienced my first battle 6 months after my pressing, when the Righteous Fury engaged a squadron of Orc raiders that had been terrorizing the shipping lanes of the Marcane Marches. I did not see the enemy. Pressed men do not see enemies. Do not stand at viewports watching the distant flashes of weapons fire. do not experience war as anything but noise and vibration, and the constant terror of not knowing what is happening beyond the metal walls that surround them. I knew only that the ship shook, that alarms sounded, that damage control teams rushed past the bilge access points with expressions of controlled panic, that somewhere above me weapons were firing and men were dying, and the fate of 40,000 souls hung in the balance of decisions made by officers I would never meet. The righteous fury took a hit amidships during that engagement. A massive shell from an Orc kill cruiser penetrated the hull 3 decks above my position, detonating in a crew barracks that housed 200 men. The explosion itself killed everyone in that space instantly. A mercy, I learned later, compared to what followed. The hull breach exposed 3 adjacent sections to vacuum before the emergency bulkheads could seal, and I listened through the metal walls as men screamed and died, as the air was torn from their lungs, as the cold and the silence of the void claimed them one by one. 117 men died in that engagement. Their names were read aloud in the memorial service that followed, a ritual that the Navy observes after every battle, acknowledgement that those who fell gave their lives in the Emperor's service. But the reading took less than 3 minutes, each name receiving perhaps a second of recognition before the next was spoken, and by the time the service ended and we returned to our duties, the dead had already begun to fade from memory, already begun to join the countless millions who had died before them in the same corridors, the same compartments, the same positions that the newly pressed would soon fill. I have survived 43 engagements since that first battle. I have listened to the ship shake and scream around me, while enemies I could not see tried to kill me, with weapons I could not comprehend. I have sealed bulkheads behind fleeing crewmates, condemning them to death so that the damage might be contained. I have organized work parties to clear debris that had once been human beings, have processed the remains of men I had known into the recycling systems that waste nothing, have written letters of condolence that I knew would never be delivered, because the families of pressed men are not tracked, are not notified, are not considered worthy of the administratum's attention, and I have watched the generations turn. This is the truth that outsiders do not understand, the reality that makes the Imperial Navy something other than a military organization, something closer to a civilization unto itself. The ships do not return to port for crew rotation. The pressed men do not serve terms and then resume their former lives. We are taken forever, and forever is not a metaphor, but a literal description of what awaits us. Men and women meet in the lower decks, form bonds in the cramped spaces between shifts, build relationships that would be called marriages if such ceremonies were permitted for pressed crew. Children are born, children who have never breathed unrecycled air, who have never seen a horizon, who do not understand concepts like outside, or weather, or ground beneath your feet. They grow up in the ship, are trained for service from the moment they can walk, are assigned to their parents' crews, or transferred to other sections based on the needs of the vessel. They live their entire lives within these metal walls, and they die here. And their children continue the cycle, generation after generation, an endless lineage of souls who know nothing but service, because service is all they have ever been permitted to know. I have grandchildren now. I have never met them. My daughter, not Mira, not the daughter I left behind on Scintilla, but another daughter born to a woman I knew in the bilges, a woman who died in a plasma accident 15 years ago. She serves in the forward gun batteries, 3 kilometers from my position, in a section of the ship I am not permitted to visit without authorization. She has children of her own, children I have seen only in the brief moments when our shifts overlap in the common areas. children who look at me with the eyes of strangers, because I am a stranger to them, because the hierarchy of the ship does not permit the luxury of family, because bonds between generations are weaknesses that the system cannot afford to accommodate. I think of Mira sometimes, in the quiet hours when memory cannot be suppressed. I wonder if she lived, if she grew, if she had children of her own on the solid ground of Scintilla. I wonder if she remembers the father who was taken from her when she was just learning to speak his name, or if I have faded from her memory as so many things fade, erased by time and distance and the simple human need to forget what cannot be recovered. She would be 40 now if she lives. She might have grandchildren of her own, grandchildren who walk beneath open skies and breathe air that has not been filtered through 1,000 lungs, who take for granted the simple freedoms that I have not experienced in 37 years. Or she might be dead, claimed by any of the 10,000 dangers that threaten human life in the hives of the Imperium. Her existence ended without my ever knowing, without my ever having the chance to say goodbye. I will never know. This is the cruelty that underlies everything else, the wound that never heals no matter how many years pass, or how many adaptations the mind makes. I was taken from my family, and my family was taken from me. And the separation is absolute, eternal, unbridgeable, by any means that exist within the rigid structures of imperial bureaucracy. There are millions like me, across the 10,000 ships of the Imperial Navy, across the billions of souls who serve in the void. There are millions who were taken as I was taken, who carry the same wounds I carry, who lie awake in their bunks during the night cycle and wonder about the families they will never see again. We do not speak of it. We cannot speak of it. To acknowledge the loss would be to admit that we are still human, still capable of feeling, still vulnerable to pain that the system considers irrelevant to our function. And so, we carry it in silence, each man and woman alone with their grief, united only in the shared understanding that no one will ever acknowledge what was taken from us, that no memorial will ever be raised to the families we lost, that our suffering is not tragedy, but merely the cost of keeping the Imperium's ships sailing. This is the life of the pressed man. This is what we endure. And I have not yet told you of the day when I finally understood what it all meant. The mutiny came in my 29th year of service. I had risen to the position of deck chief by then, had accumulated the authority and the experience that made me valuable to the officers who commanded the righteous fury, had become, though I did not recognize it at the time, one of the pillars upon which the ship's discipline rested. The pressed men feared me. The petty officers respected me. The bosuns consulted me when trouble brewed in the lower decks, trusted my judgment about which men might break and which might hold, relied upon my knowledge of the labyrinthine social structures that existed beneath the notice of those who lived above. I had forgotten what it felt like to be one of them. This is the truth I must confess, the failure that made what followed possible. I had spent so many years climbing, so many years adapting, so many years becoming what the system required me to become, that I had lost the ability to see the lower decks through the eyes of those who still suffered there. I saw only problems to be managed, resources to be allocated, discipline to be maintained. I had become the machine I served. The mutiny began in the aft bilge sections, among crews who worked the plasma waste channels, the lowest and most dangerous assignment on the ship, reserved for those who had committed infractions too minor for execution, but too serious for mere flogging. They were desperate men, broken men, men who had nothing left to lose, because everything had already been taken from them, and they had found a leader. His name was Torvin Kell. He had been a bosun once, a man of authority and respect. until he had been caught protecting a pressed man from punishment, had stepped between a rating and the neural whip, had spoken words that could not be unsaid, had been stripped of his rank and cast down into the plasma channels as an example to others who might consider mercy a virtue worth practicing. He had survived 3 years in that hell, 3 years that should have killed him, 3 years that had instead forged him into something harder and more dangerous than the man who had entered. He had been organizing for months before anyone noticed, speaking to men in the brief moments between shifts, planting seeds of resistance in minds that had been taught to accept their fate, building a network of the dam that stretched across the lower decks like roots beneath the surface of soil. By the time the officers became aware of what was happening, he had recruited over 2,000 souls to his cause. 2,000 men and women who had decided that death in rebellion was preferable to life in submission, who had found in Torvin Kell a voice for the rage they had been forbidden to express. I was summoned to the captain's quarters on the day the mutiny was discovered, brought before officers I had never met, men who looked upon me with the cold assessment of those who view other humans as instruments rather than individuals. They told me what was happening. They told me that the mutiny must be crushed before it could spread, that the example must be made so terrible that no one would dare attempt such a thing again for generations, that failure was not acceptable because failure would mean the loss of the ship itself. And they told me that I would lead the suppression, not the bosuns, whose loyalty was not in question, but whose numbers were insufficient for the task, not the armsmen who were needed to maintain security in the upper decks during the crisis. Me, a pressed man who had risen from the bilges, who knew the lower decks as the officers never could, who understood how the pressed men thought and how they would fight and where they would hide when the killing began. They gave me authority over 300 ratings armed with shock mauls and shotguns. They gave me permission to use whatever force was necessary to kill whoever needed killing, to do whatever had to be done to restore order. They gave me, in that moment, more power than I had ever held in my life. And they gave it to me because they knew I would use it, because they had watched me climb and understood what that climbing meant, because they recognized in me the same ruthlessness that they cultivated in themselves. I should have refused. I should have joined the mutiny, should have recognized in Torvin Kell a man who was fighting for everything I had once believed in, should have chosen solidarity with my fellow pressed men over loyalty to a system that had stolen my life and my family and my humanity. That would have been the righteous choice. That would have been the human choice. I did not refuse. I led my 300 into the lower decks, into the labyrinth of corridors and crawlways where 2,000 desperate souls had barricaded themselves, had armed themselves with improvised weapons and stolen tools, had prepared to fight and die for the impossible dream of freedom. I knew those spaces. I had worked them for years, had memorized every junction and access point, had helped design the very security protocols that the mutineers were now trying to exploit. I knew where they would hide, where they would fight, where they would run when their positions became untenable, and I used that knowledge to kill them. The suppression lasted 3 days. 3 days of hunting through darkened corridors, of breaching barricades built from maintenance equipment and furniture torn from crew quarters, of close quarters violence that left the deck plates slick with blood and the air thick with the smell of burned flesh and discharged weapons. The mutineers fought with the desperation of those who know they are already dead, who have accepted their fate and seek only to take as many of their enemies with them as possible. They fought and they died, and I led the men who killed them. I found Torvin Kell on the 3rd day, in a maintenance bay deep in the aft sections where he had made his final stand. He was alone by then, his followers dead or captured, his rebellion crushed, his dream of freedom revealed as the fantasy it had always been. He was wounded, bleeding from a dozen cuts, his makeshift weapon, a length of pipe wrapped in electrical cable, hanging loose in his grip. He looked at me as I entered, and his eyes held no fear, no anger, only a terrible, weary recognition. "You were one of us once," he said. "I remember you, Cole. I remember when you came aboard. Remember the look in your eyes when they processed you. You still had hope then. You still believed you might find a way back to whatever life they took you from." I did not respond. I could not respond. The words had struck something in me that I had believed long dead, had reached past the walls I had built and touched the wound that still festered beneath. "What happened to that man?" Kel asked. "What did they do to you? To turn you into this?" And I understood in that moment what had happened to me. I understood the full scope of my transformation, the complete extent of my fall. I had not merely adapted to the system, I had become it. I had internalized its values so completely that I could no longer distinguish between its demands and my own will. I was not a man serving the machine. I was the machine, wearing a man's face, speaking with a man's voice, carrying out the machine's imperatives with the machine's perfect indifference to human suffering. The system had not broken me. It had done something far worse. It had remade me in its own image, had transformed me from victim into instrument, had ensured that I would perpetuate the very horrors that had been inflicted upon me. And I had not even noticed it happening, had climbed and adapted and survived without ever recognizing that each step upward was a step away from everything I had once valued, everything I had once been. I raised my shotgun. Torvin Kell did not flinch, did not beg, did not close his eyes. He simply watched me, waiting for the ending he had known was coming since the moment he first spoke rebellion in the plasma channels. "Do it," he said. "Finish what they started. Prove that there's nothing left of the man you used to be." I pulled the trigger. The recoil kicked against my shoulder. The noise filled the maintenance bay. And Torvin Kell, the man who had dared to dream of freedom, who had sacrificed everything to give voice to the voiceless, who had reminded me in his final moments of the humanity I had surrendered, fell to the deck and did not move again. I stood over his body for a long time, long enough that my men began to wonder, began to exchange glances, began to question whether their deck chief had finally cracked under the strain of 3 days of killing. I did not notice them. I noticed only the blood pooling beneath the corpse, the stillness of features that had been animated by conviction only moments before, the silence that followed the death of a man who had believed in something beyond survival. He had been wrong. The mutiny had been doomed from the start, a gesture of defiance that could never have succeeded against the overwhelming force the Navy could bring to bear. But he had been right, too. He had seen what I had become, had named it with his dying breath, had forced me to confront the truth I had been hiding from myself for 29 years. I was no longer Brennan Cole, the dock worker from Hive Gloriana, who had been taken from his family and pressed into service against his will. That man was dead, had died somewhere in the years of climbing and adapting, had been replaced by something that wore his memories but no longer shared his soul. I was a component now, a function, a tool shaped by the system to serve its purposes, indistinguishable from the countless others who had been shaped in the same way, who enforced the same brutalities, who perpetuated the same injustices, who had forgotten what it meant to be human in a machine that consumed humanity as fuel. The suppression was declared complete. The captain commended my service, promoted me to senior deck chief, granted me privileges that made my life marginally more comfortable, while changing nothing of substance. The mutineers who had survived, fewer than 100 out of 2,000, were executed publicly, their bodies displayed in the common areas as warnings to any who might consider following their example. And the ship continued on, unchanged, unstoppable, eternal in its indifference to the suffering that kept it sailing. 8 years have passed since the mutiny, 8 years in which I have continued to serve, continued to climb, continued to enforce the discipline that keeps the righteous fury functioning. I have not forgotten what Torvin Kell showed me in that maintenance bay, have not lost the understanding that came to me as I stood over his corpse. But understanding has not led to change. Understanding has not restored what was taken. Understanding has merely added another layer of weight to the burden I carry, another dimension to the suffering that defines my existence. I know what I am now. I know what I have become. And I continue to function, because functioning is all that remains to me. I am 60 years old now, or thereabouts. The ship's chronometers and my own aging flesh do not always agree on how much time has passed, and I have long since stopped trying to reconcile the difference. My body is failing. 37 years of labor in environments that were never meant to sustain human life have taken their toll, have worn down the joints and scarred the lungs, and accumulated damage in organs that the ship's medici staff can patch but never truly repair. I have perhaps 5 years left, perhaps 10, if the Emperor sees fit to grant me an extension I have not earned and do not deserve. And then I will die, as all pressed men die, and my body will be processed through the same recycling systems I once maintained as a bilge worker. And the righteous fury will continue its eternal voyage without pausing to note my absence. I have been thinking in these final years about what my life has meant. Not in the grand sense. I am not foolish enough to believe that my individual existence carries meaning on the scale that matters, the scale of empires and gods, and the eternal war that grinds across the galaxy. But in the small sense, the human sense, the sense that asks whether the years I have lived added anything to the sum of existence or merely subtracted from it, I do not have a comforting answer. I was taken. I survived. I adapted. I rose. I became something that the man I was would not have recognized, would not have understood, would have recoiled from in horror if he could have seen across the years to witness what his future held. I enforced the system that enslaved me. I killed men who dreamed of the freedom I once dreamed of. I perpetuated horrors that were inflicted upon me, passed them down to new generations of pressed men who will pass them down in turn, an endless chain of suffering that stretches back to the founding of the Navy and forward to whatever end awaits the Imperium itself. And yet, I am still here, and yet I still remember the man I was, even if I can no longer be him. And yet some fragment of Brennan Cole, the dock worker, the husband, the father, persists within the machine I have become, refuses to be entirely erased, continues to bear witness even when witnessing serves no purpose I can name. This is what I have come to understand in these twilight years, when death approaches and the need for meaning grows desperate. We are not meant to survive this. The system that claims us, the machine that transforms us, the navy that consumes our lives and our humanity. It is not designed to produce survivors. It is designed to produce fuel, to convert human beings into the energy that keeps the warships sailing, to extract everything we have to give and discard the husks when we are empty. Those of us who persist, who retain some core of self despite everything that seeks to erase it, who continue to remember and to feel and to grieve for what we have lost, We are anomalies. We are errors in the system, components that have failed to be fully processed, remnants of humanity that should have been consumed but somehow were not. Our survival is not triumph. It is not victory. It is merely the failure of a machine that is vast but not perfect, that claims most but not all, that grinds souls to powder but occasionally leaves fragments intact. And perhaps, there is meaning in that. Not the meaning of heroes and martyrs, not the meaning that inspires songs and monuments and remembrance across the ages, but a smaller meaning, a quieter meaning, the meaning of a man who endured what should not have been endurable and emerged with something still intact, however damaged, however diminished, however far from what it once was. I think of the pressed men who serve beneath me now, the young ones who were born aboard this ship and have never known anything else, the taken ones who still carry the shock of their abduction in their eyes, who still wake from dreams of families they will never see again. I cannot save them. I cannot change the system that holds them. I cannot offer them anything but the same brutal calculus of survival that was offered to me. Adapt or die, climb or be crushed, become the machine or be consumed by it. But I can bear witness. I can remember what they suffer, can acknowledge their humanity even when the system refuses to, can see them as people rather than resources, even as I enforce the order that treats them as nothing more. This is not enough. It will never be enough, but it is something, and something is more than the nothing that the machine offers, more than the complete erasure that claims those who surrender entirely to what they have become. I think of Sarah sometimes in the quiet hours. I think of Mira. I think of the life I might have lived if the press gangs had not come to our corridor that night, if I had been permitted to grow old beside my wife and watch my daughter become a woman, if my grandchildren had known my face and my voice and the stories I would have told them about the world beyond the hive. I think of these things, and the grief is as fresh as it was 37 years ago, has not diminished with time, has not been processed or adapted or transformed into something bearable. This grief is the proof that I am still human. This pain is the evidence that the machine has not entirely won, that some fragment of the man who was taken still exists within the function that replaced him. I carry it not because carrying it serves any purpose, but because releasing it would mean surrendering the last thing that belongs to me, rather than to the system, the last piece of myself that has not been consumed. The righteous fury sails on. It will sail on after I am dead, will continue its patrol of the Calixis sector, will fight battles and take damage, and be repaired and fight again. New pressed men will fill its lower decks, will suffer as I have suffered, will adapt or die as I adapted or died. Some of them will climb, will become what I became, will enforce the same brutalities and perpetuate the same horrors. Others will break, will be processed and recycled, will become nothing more than nutrients feeding the systems that sustain the crew that sustains the ship. And the ship will not notice, will not care, will simply continue. Because continuing is what ships do, what the Navy does, what the Imperium itself does, grinding forward through the darkness, consuming everything in its path, enduring through sheer momentum when purpose has long since been forgotten. This is the life of the pressed man. This is what we become, what we endure, what we mean in a galaxy that does not care about meaning, that measures worth only in utility, that discards souls as readily as it discards spent ammunition casings. I offer this testimony not as complaint, not as accusation, not as plea for rescue or redemption. There is no rescue. There is no redemption. There is only the truth, spoken by one who has lived it, who has been transformed by it, who carries the scars of it in his flesh and the weight of it in his soul. Remember us. That is all I ask. Remember that behind the statistics of naval recruitment, behind the numbers that fill the administratum's ledgers, behind the abstract concept of crew that populates the warships of the Imperial Navy, there are human beings, men and women, with names and histories and families torn away, children born into bondage they did not choose, generations living and dying in metal corridors, knowing nothing of sunlight or open air, or the simple freedom to walk in a direction of their own choosing. We are millions. We are invisible. We are the fuel that burns to keep the Imperium sailing. And we are still human, despite everything that seeks to make us otherwise. My name is Brennan Cole. I was a dock worker on Scintilla. I had a wife named Sarah and a daughter named Mira, and I loved them, and I was taken from them, and I have spent 37 years becoming something I do not recognize. But I remember. Even now, even after everything, I remember. And as long as I remember, some part of the man I was still exists. This is my testimony. This is my meaning. Let it stand for all of us who cannot speak, who have been silenced by the machine, who have been ground to nothing in the gears of an empire that does not know our names. We were here. We suffered. We endured. Remember us. The Emperor may not, but perhaps you will, and perhaps that is enough.